of course, Erin, thank you so much for doing this. It really is a treat that you were able to coordinate it. So I like to thank a few of our sponsors, which is Photo Shelter, Epson, Pro Photo Daily, American Photographer, and Archive Magazine. We have Erin Trieb, who's been to Ukraine for how long were you there, Erin?
3 months.
3 months. And she starts off the remainder of the week. We have Marcus Yam on tomorrow night and Paula Brownstein on Friday night. So without any further ado, Erin, it's all yours. Again, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, and what a great lineup you have this week, Frank. I was there with at the same time as Marcus and Paula as well. Great. So we, helped each other and were there shooting at the same time. So they produced great work as well.
Yeah, and if you want, as you present, give us some color about teaming with people. That would be great for the audience as well.
About what with people? Sorry.
Teaming with people. The camaraderie around working with other journalists. Whatever little antidotes you can give us would be great.
Sure. And everyone who's on, feel free to interrupt me at any time. I love interactive presentations instead of me rambling on and on for an hour straight. So please feel free to pipe in.
Yeah, just put your questions in the chat room and we'll integrate it in for sure.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen now. Okay. Is that working?
You're great, Erin.
Great. All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I'm so happy to be here and to talk about this work. Ukraine is, has been and is the most difficult conflict for me to talk about, simply because I still to this day, 9 months later, haven't been able to wrap my head around what it was I experienced and photographed. It was such a different war. It continues to be just very different from a lot of the other conflicts I've photographed. And so, yeah, it's always helpful to talk with a group about the war in Ukraine, because it helps me also understand it better and understand my experiences better.
Why different, Erin?
Frank, I've photographed various conflicts in mostly in Iraq and Afghanistan over the past decade. I spent a bit of time in Syria. I photographed Iraq when ISIS invaded in 2014. I've been embedded with the commandos in Afghanistan and various military units in Afghanistan between 2009 and 2011. And this was different because first, I think from a personal experience, I'm used to the Arab and Muslim world. That was very different, just in terms of the culture, the dynamics, how things kind of operate. And secondly, as powerful and dangerous as ISIS was, Russia is a world-leading military force, and that was different. It was, I think the stakes were a lot higher in terms of the destruction that could be dealt out, and how quickly things could change. And so for me, that it was a different type of theater. I've been in a lot of conflicts, but not one I would say that was against a country as unified, as big as Russia, a leading power in terms of military force. So that was kind of a whole new ballgame for me. And I'd like to start with just the first image that I shot the morning that the Russians invaded. It was about 7:30 in the morning. I had just received information on my cell phone. I think a news bulletin came across my phone that the invasion had started. And immediately I grabbed my cameras and went outside my hotel. And this is what I saw, just completely vacant streets. No one was outside. all the shops had closed. It was as if we all had found out kind of at the same time, and then the city was really bracing itself. I mean, you could hear really a pin drop. It was so quiet and eerie. And yeah, I had arrived to Ukraine about 10 days before the invasion on a hunch. I simply had an idea that, Russia might invade. I wasn't sure. We were hearing mixed reports. Some colleagues told me, it's probably not worth it to come. You might arrive and then just go home a couple of weeks later. But I went anyway, thinking that it would be the best place to be if things did start. And sure enough, that morning on February 24th, things begun. And so, yeah, things developed really quickly after that. Immediately, people started going to bus stations, train stations. There was huge lines and convoys of traffic trying to evacuate the city of Kyiv, which is where I was based most of the time when I was there. I would stay in Kyiv and then travel out to different areas and different cities that were under attack at that time. So this was at the main central train station in Kyiv. And this picture, I was up close trying to get people's facial expressions, but it doesn't quite convey the thousands upon thousands of people that were jam-packed into the train and bus stations. But this picture does a little bit more. It was very crowded. Hundreds of people trying to evacuate. And it was hard too, because a lot of people couldn't leave the city, either due to, illness, or they had small children, or elderly Ukrainians weren't able to get to the train station. And then of course you had men ages 18 through 65 who weren't allowed to leave the country. They were required by law to stay in Ukraine in case the Ukrainian military called upon them to fight. This is another picture from the train station. Again, just really packed spaces. People were frantic, very emotional, trying to get out. And this was, for, I think, shooting the beginning phases of this conflict. I don't want to say they were easy, but this was one of those situations that photographers, or it's kind of a dream situation where we're a fly on the wall. People were so wrapped up in their own either, logistical or emotional turmoil that they didn't pay attention to me. I mean, I think when I took this picture, I was hanging off the side of the train that was about to start moving to get sort of a downward shot. And, later on in the conflict, I think it became a lot more difficult to shoot. There were just more, government, I guess as the conflict continued, there were the government would come out and not allow the press to shoot certain things, or you'd have to have very strict permits that were hard to obtain. But because this was in the very beginning, there were not a lot of rules. And so we were really able to kind of move quite freely, which was really helpful in terms of getting pictures and capturing these really important moments.
And so how long did you stay at the train stations?
I would go at the beginning of the invasion, I'd go every day for a few hours, and it was just mayhem. I mean, you could turn any corner you could turn, there'd be a new story, a new scene to photograph. One of my favorite things to photograph, which I don't think I actually have a picture of it in the slideshow, were the pets that people would, take with them when evacuating. I saw everything from parrots, of course, cats and dogs. I saw a pet pig, rabbits, gerbils. The Ukrainians are as obsessed with their pets and animals as I would say any other country. You know, you would see some of them putting their dogs in little buggy strollers with blankets and things like that. And a lot of people refuse to leave home without their animals. So that was a pretty, yeah, I don't know. It was obviously sad, but also heartwarming to know how dedicated they were to their pets and animals, and that they didn't want to leave without them.
So so at this point, the bombs haven't started to land, right? I mean, or wait, certainly where you were.
They have, yeah, and
They
I'll
have.
and that's coming up in the next set of pictures. Basically, I want to say from day one, I can't remember where the bombs struck on the first day, but certainly by day two, which I'm about to get to those pictures, there was massive damage being done to civilian apartment buildings inside the city. So yeah, I mean, I think it was people were leaving, you know, for sort of twofold, you know, reasons. One, they were afraid of what could happen, and two, people were already starting to experience the, you know, basically heavy bombing, heavy warfare, and it was so random as well in the city. No one ever knew where it was going to hit. And that's the other thing, is that, you know, compared to a lot of my experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, there's been a clearly defined front line. You know, when I covered Mosul and the liberation of Mosul, when the Iraqi forces went in to liberate Mosul from ISIS, we'd pull up to this sort of blockade, this one street, and we all knew if you go past cement, you know, that cement block over there, you're going to be in a really dodgy area. And if you even go a block further, it was kind of like all bets were off, you know. So we, you know, visually we could see what was safe, what wasn't safe. We'd be advised by our, you know, Iraqi colleagues on where to go, where not to go. And that was simply not the case in Ukraine. It was kind of a free-for-all in terms of where the Russians were bombing. And the Russians, you know, the Russian military said that they were targeting military installations, but we would show up you know, as soon as we heard an airstrike, or as soon as we heard that a place had been hit, and there was not a military installation nearby in some of these locations. So I'll show you that next, some of the apartment buildings that I went inside that got bombed. But this is basically a photo of the evacuation, and how, you know, there was this huge bottleneck of traffic leaving the city. And then of course on the other side of the highway, it's completely clear.
And that photograph, if that clock is right, that was at midnight, just after midnight. On the previous shot, across the bridge there. Go back those two slides. Yeah. So if that clock if that's a clock there over the bridge, over that, yeah, right there, that's just after midnight.
Well, that's interesting. That should say, I don't think, no, that wasn't after midnight. It was definitely
Okay.
at dusk. I don't know if the 24 is representing the 24th of February. You'd think that there would be an O and then a 2
Right.
to say February 24th, but no, that was before, well before midnight. I think it was probably around 7 or 8 p.m. And so upcoming, I'll show you some of the apartment blocks that were hit. But before that, I wanted to show kind of how things played out in chronological order. You know, you first, on day one, you had this mass exodus of Ukrainians leaving the city, fleeing Kyiv and then, you know, surrounding areas. And then immediately, I want to say this was probably the 25th, the very next day, you had Ukrainian civilians mobilizing. And that's another thing that I've not seen in other conflicts, was how united the civilian front of this conflict was. It was kind of amazing to watch these ordinary people, this guy in the middle who's holding the rifle, I think he was a real estate agent. You know, these people had ordinary jobs. They worked in IT or worked as baristas at local coffee shops. And immediately they all joined. And I think what sort of laid the platform for that was that Ukraine has been fighting Russia in the East since 2014. So for a lot of Ukrainians, this was not a new story. It was just a bigger version of a story that they were already living, if that makes sense.
It was an escalation, right?
An escalation, correct. And, the next day, though, you had the stories that you saw on the news were true. There were literally babushkas, these, elderly grandmothers emptying out bottles of wine and beer to make Molotov cocktails. It was almost a caricature of itself, if that makes sense. And really, photographically speaking, just sort of a visual, yeah, to be able to photograph that in real time is really spectacular and humbling at the same time. So, the mobilization of the Ukrainians was really, really wild. It was very quick. They were very organized and united, and they put a lot of their differences aside. This guy was the one that I was mentioning that was a real estate agent. He was about 22, 23, and he said he was in real estate, and as soon as the invasion happened, he signed up to fight in what the Ukrainians were calling the Territorial Defense Unit. And it was their all civilian, all volunteer based unit that basically would train and then be called to the front lines if and when necessary. This is a boy who was carrying empty bottles down to a basement to make Molotov cocktails out of them. And we were several floors here beneath the street level. So this was they were keeping the Molotov cocktails for the most part under the radar because they, I imagine they're illegal in Ukraine because they're not considered I don't think it's a weapon that's blessed by NATO, but this was something they were doing under wraps, and so it was a bit tricky to photograph this without getting getting eyebrows, people raising their eyebrows. Let's see, and then this is an apartment building that I had mentioned earlier. This was one of the first bombings that I photographed. There was not a military installation near enough to this building where it would have warranted this building being struck, if that makes sense. And so, when Russian media and the Russian military would say that they were targeting Ukrainian military or military installations, at least from what we saw on the ground, it simply wasn't true in cases like this.
So Erin, when did you realize that the Russians' calculation was really wrong, that they were going to come in and just walk over and it was all going to be done, and this would be a 2 or 3 week operation, and the Ukrainians would give in? I mean, was it when you saw them, mobilizing as volunteers? When was that moment where you said, wow, I had no idea the Ukrainians had such an incredible spine? How long did that take?
Yeah, I think for me, it was when the 40-mile convoy of Russian tanks and vehicles was stalled. There was a moment when we heard on the news that the Russian military forces were 11 kilometers outside the center of Kiev, which is where my hotel was and where a lot of journalists were staying. And, we kind of thought, okay, this is it. We either have to evacuate or we kind of dig in and stay until the very last minute. And a lot of people left, and I was, I decided to stay and to see what would happen. Of course, I had a vehicle that was gonna, I could hop in at the last minute and to get out of the city if I needed. So it's always good to have a backup plan like that. But I am glad that I did stay, because they didn't reach the center of Kyiv, and they were stalled. And they were stalled mainly because of the fighting in Bucha and Irpin, which we now know is where a lot of the violence and the killings and atrocities took place. So Irpin and Bucha are both located about, I want to say, 20 kilometers northwest of Kyiv, and that was kind of the stopping point of the convoy. They couldn't get past that. And so when we all realized that they were stalled, for several days and they weren't moving, that's when it became clear that it was like, okay, this is not going to be as easy as they thought it would be, and the Ukrainians are putting up a real fight.
So early on. And at this point now, are you working for an organization? Are you working for the Post, the Times?
I worked for a handful of different clients when I was there. I started with Bloomberg News, their wire service, and then I also worked for a few German publications, Die Zeit, and I worked for Der Spiegel. I might have worked for Der Spiegel. No, it was Geo I worked for. I did a big story on women, war through the eyes of women, for Glamour magazine. And then I also worked for Business Insider.
Yeah. So just to give people who don't know a little insight, how do you just send out an email blast to your 8 or 12 different clients that you work for? I'm in Ukraine. Do you want me to shoot for you? I mean, how does that work?
Yes. Well, Frank, in fact, I sent an email blast out to about 85 different clients and editors. Okay. I like to cover all my bases. Just
Smart.
in case.
No one's a better business photojournalist than you. That I know.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's helpful to let people know where you are. Also, a lot of my editors are friends. So, just out of concern for my well-being, I think it's helpful, to stay in correspondence and let them know where I'm at. I sent that out probably the day I arrived, and then started lining up work. Of course, there wasn't a lot of work before the invasion started, because it wasn't news yet, and then, after the 24th of February, my phone was ringing off the hook, and I had to turn down actually a lot of work. Which, I'm lucky to be able to say that, given
and turning it down because what you're shooting only has so many different views to it that you can't be sending everyone the same content. Is that why it's that way?
No, it's because once you agree to be on assignment for a certain publication, you can't really then work for another publication on the same day, especially if you're doing a large swath or overview of news coverage. So for instance, I could never work for AP and Reuters on the same day shooting for The Wire, if that makes sense.
Yep. Okay.
If it's two separate assignments, that's different. If I had a morning assignment and then an evening assignment, but because I was working on larger stories that were more in depth, that was also taking multiple assignments in a day is hard in the normal world, let alone doing it in a war zone is even more complicated. So, once I was on for someone, I normally would stay on for them until our contract finished, and then I'd pick up work for someone else, if that makes sense.
Yep. Okay.
This was a high-rise apartment building. As you can see, the side was completely knocked out, wiped out. There was fire damage, even to units that weren't hit with the bombing. Up above that gash on the right side of the building, there was a ton of fire damage, a lot of broken glass. And a lot of people's apartments were completely ruined. And it was really hard to understand how the Russian military could justify bombing an apartment complex that was occupied by civilians, clearly occupied by civilians too. I mean, it wasn't, hard to decipher that, just even, just being outside the building. But here you can see I went inside one of the units, and it was completely charred. I'm guessing by the blast force. And this was a different building down by the radio tower, which was bombed as well in hopes to disrupt Ukrainian radio communications. But again, they bombed the tower, and then I would say 300 to 400 yards away from the tower, they also bombed a civilian gym. This was an exercise gym, not unlike a YMCA that we would go to. So, it was what the Russian media was saying and the Russian government was saying was very, very, very different from what we were witnessing as journalists on the ground.
And where do you get your news, or how do you get your news while you're on the ground?
Well, aside from watching the news, which was often helpful, we have, a variety of sources from, Ukrainians we know on the ground to, there weren't a lot of fixers at the time. Most of them, fixers, drivers, and interpreters had evacuated. But we did have some internal chat groups on WhatsApp. We had communications with the Ukrainian government that would alert us when buildings were struck, so we could get there to document and to report. So yeah, I mean, it's a lot of comms being shared among colleagues on the ground and chat groups on smartphones and WhatsApp groups, things like that. Mm-hmm. But what was interesting was this was the first conflict where I actually saw more footage of fighting on the news than I did in first person. And that was really, really bizarre. So for instance, Bucha, which I mentioned, is where the convoy got stuck and basically couldn't enter the city because it got halted in that suburb. In Bucha, there was fierce fighting for 2 to 3 weeks until the township was liberated. But we couldn't get close to it because we were blocked by the Ukrainian military. And so I'd see footage from, soldiers' cell phones, or I think maybe 1 or 2 CNN correspondents got in and was able to report on, on the situation there. But again, I was watching it on television in my hotel room, and then I couldn't access it. And that was really frustrating, right? As a conflict reporter, to not be able to get to do my job properly, and yet witnessing it on a screen. Yeah, it was a really frustrating war to cover.
But that's got to be so weird to be miles away, and you're now watching it on TV. That's got to be so strange.
It was, because from my hotel balcony, I could see the fires above Bucha, and we could hear the bombings, the gunfire, the missiles, and then I'd hear it, and then in correlation would see on the news. So it was almost like, I'd look out my window, then I'd look at the TV, and look out my window and look at the TV, but I couldn't actually be there physically in person. And it was very it messes with your head a bit.
and the interesting thing is, as a photojournalist, you and your colleagues are standing there. We got to get there. You've got to go into the danger, which goes into the whole psyche of being a photojournalist, right? You want to be where it's happening.
Right, and this was around the time that 3 colleagues had been killed on the start of the conflict. Were killed near Irpin. So we were all on pins and needles about going in there alone or taking unnecessary risk. A lot of, we were playing, I would say, for the first time in a long time, I didn't see anyone trying to be a daredevil or yeah, there was an amount of precaution that I haven't seen take place in other conflicts.
Right.
And I think that was really good and smart because there were multiple deaths from the get-go. What was I going to say about that? Yeah, to get into Irpen, it was you had to kind of walk in on foot by your, and it's so dodgy, it was so tricky. And I did go in one day by myself, and I didn't like the feel of it. I luckily ran into a bunch of colleagues, and so we kind of huddled together as a group, but yeah, it was not at all a safe way to cover what was happening there.
So in that moment, do you say to yourself, this was really a mistake? Why did I do this? Like as sort of, or is that later in the evening where do you do a little self-analysis? I can't make that mistake again. I'm lucky I got out, that kind of a thing. Do you do reflection at the moment? Do you do, when you're flying home, like, or now?
It's funny, it's not really a mistake until shit goes sideways.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I have been in situations where things have gone really badly, and when I got out, I thought, I'll never do that again. Because I was okay in Irpen that day, I came out thinking, okay, I went about that as safely as I could, and things didn't get out of hand, and so yeah, it was a good decision. But the day after, I was in this one spot, which I'll show you is in a photograph coming up. A colleague that I didn't know him, he was killed in that exact same. We believe he was killed. I was standing right where he was killed 24 hours previous to. So it's like, you tend to not be regretful about your choices if nothing bad happens, and then if something bad happens, you're of course beating yourself up about, like, why did I make such a stupid choice, right?
Yeah.
So this was some further damage done to that same exercise facility. And this, in the background, the smoke I was mentioning, that's coming from Bucha. So Irpin, can you guys see my arrow?
Yes.
Can I move it in a circle like that?
Yep.
Okay, so this is Bucha here. And then there was this road to my left, to the left of this sandy area. And it was a bridge that was blown up. And that was the bridge that was shown over and over and over again on all the news networks. It was kind of the famous bridge because it was really visual. And then also it was where everybody was getting stuck trying to flee from Irpen. And the Ukrainian military blew it up on purpose to stop that Russian convoy. So if you see these pink buildings over here, that's leading into the city of Irpen.
This image is really interesting in that, you have two group, soldiers going both directions, because so much of what we've seen over these weeks of doing these presentations, it's mostly seeing the bombed out buildings, and it's all done by air. I mean, these are the guys, and the women who are in the trenches. It's like World War II, right? I mean, go take that hill or go, control that bridge. It's really an interesting shot.
Thank you, Frank. Yeah, they were doing a shift exchange. So I would say men and women, but in this group specifically, there were only men. So I'll say men. In this situation, there was a group of Ukrainian men, soldiers who were stationed in Irpin fighting, and then they got pulled out to take a break, and then another group of soldiers came in to replace them. So they were doing the sort of a switch at that point. And Frank, you have Marcus on tomorrow, right?
Yes.
Make sure you ask him about the time he rode a bicycle into your pen.
Okay.
When he told me that story, I nearly fell out of my seat.
All right. Everyone has to stay. Everyone has to come back tomorrow to hear the Marcus bicycle trip. You gave him up, Erin.
I hope he doesn't get mad at me for that. And so this picture was on the bridge, or what was left of the bridge. The bridge was actually above us, and we were kind of walking on these, ply boards, this wooden scraps that were put down over the river so that we could get back and forth across. And mainly people were being, either they were evacuating on foot, or people who had been injured were being evacuated by medical volunteers, such as the person you see here. And this was in Bucha. Let me just go forward real quick to see what we've got. I meant to put this picture later on, so apologies for that. But this was a photograph of basically the aftermath of the destruction in Bucha after the city was liberated and we were allowed to go in. And this little dog followed me for about an hour, and I tried to pick him up and he growled at me, so I didn't get him. I didn't scoop him up. I wish I had. But another journalist who was also there was followed by this dog, and he ended up taking him home and finding him a new home. And I got to go visit him later, and his name was Tank, because we called the street that's featured here Tank Street, because it's where all the abandoned Russian tanks were set on fire. And so he was named Tank. And luckily we, another journalist found him a family to stay with, which is a nice, hopeful story.
Yeah, Erin, listening to you, you bring sort of your own humanity to your presentation, which is very engaging. And I would assume, so I was going to ask you in a different way, that sort of it helps you, or does it help you in dealing with the things that you see, that you can get cuddly with this dog in the middle of this this wartime situation?
Yeah, I always say human first, photographer second. My heart is always, I'm an empath. I feel my own emotions all the time, and I feel other people's emotions whether I want to or not. And I'm definitely a sponge in environments like this. So for me, being a humanitarian and being a human and having compassion and love for my fellow human beings is the most important thing that I can do in that situation. And if I happen to get some telling pictures and important pictures out of it, then that's a really happy byproduct. But I always aim to be a human first and to exercise compassion. I don't think we can do our job properly if we don't do that.
You're right.
And this is the picture I wanted to point out. If you see where my arrow is, past this structure that is called a hedgehog, it's like a blockade that I think was invented in World War I in trench warfare, but they started using them in the Ukrainian war. But basically the whole street going down the street is shut down. And this was kind of, for lack of a better term, it was kind of no man's land. And there were tons of pressure plate IEDs and booby traps and all sorts of things lined up and down the street. So we didn't go any further than this cement truck on the left.
What is a pressure plate?
A pressure plate is a
Mine?
yeah, like a landmine. Like basically, if you step on it, it detonates.
Okay.
Yeah, it takes pressure to detonate. But this was the location that I was mentioning where the very next day, a journalist was killed, and
Mm.
it's unclear how he was killed. There were mixed reports. Some said it was sniper fire. Um, I don't recall there being any snipers the day we were there, although there could have been some, but we might not have seen them. But as you can see here on the right, there was a Ukrainian foxhole surrounded by sandbags here. So it's not like, there weren't Russian forces at the ready, like in this area. They were, far beyond, I would say a kilometer or two at least down this street. So yeah, it was, and that was really unclear and confusing too, as to how our fellow reporters and journalists were getting killed, because I think there's still investigations going on concerning the 3 deaths that happened at the beginning of the war. But I guess my point is that you just don't know if it's going to be, wrong place at the wrong time. Had I been there the next day, it could have been me who was killed. Luckily, I felt fairly safe in this environment, and I was with 4 other colleagues, and we were all, we were being careful and discreet, but we were photographing and trying to make work. So yeah. And this is another picture of an injured person who was being carted across the makeshift bridge from Irpin into the greater part of Kyiv. And I wanted to show some pictures of the destruction in some of the places that were liberated. This is Borodyanka. This was probably, I want to say 3 weeks to a month after the invasion. So I want to say, no, it wasn't even that far. It was probably around March 15th that I took this photo. And basically the way that it worked was, when these suburbs like Borodyanka, Bucha, Irpin were occupied, we really couldn't access them. We were, kept out by the Ukrainian military. And then once the Russians were pushed out and the towns were liberated, the press would start trickling in order to make those first pictures of the destruction that happened. And Borodyanka was really, really, I mean, it was just decimated. In a lot of senses, it was worse than Bucha, not in terms of the random killings, but the structural damage was worse. And this building in particular, cluster bombs were used, which I wasn't familiar with cluster bombings until this conflict, but basically it's when one bomb, I guess, is launched, and then, tiny dozens of separate bombs kind of blast outwards indiscriminately. So, it wasn't, they weren't targeting, there was no decisive targeting, right? It was just a random blast here and there, which, as you can see, destroyed a 6 to 8 floor apartment building. So it was really, really catastrophic.
Erin, someone had a question, John had a question regarding the photo where your fellow journalist died. How far away is that from the Russian lines?
Yeah, let me go back. We were told that they were somewhere around this white building, maybe where these trees were. We were told the distance was 1 to 2 kilometers, which I'm much better at miles, but it basically wasn't a lot of, it wasn't a huge area. They were holed up somewhere, I think, over here.
Okay.
And this was kind of the last crossing point. This was the last Ukrainian military. I wouldn't even call it a checkpoint. I would say, I mean, to me, it's a foxhole. It's just a couple of soldiers dug in at a post. And they, for obvious reasons, wouldn't let us move past there. And it would have been really unwise to try to do that anyway. And this was at the, I believe it's called the Church of Saint Peter's, where the mass graves began to be dug early on when Bucha opened back up. So when Bucha was liberated, gosh, I wish I could remember the date. It had to have been around, it was around the third week of the war. So I want to say around mid-March, March 15th, somewhere around there. You started having residents trickle back in to the town. And upon coming back in, they would realize, oh, my brother's been missing for, several days, or my sister, my cousin, my daughter. And not being able to find them, a lot of families would gather at the cemetery behind the church to see if the bodies being exhumated were relatives. And so, the press, as we do, went to the cemetery and waited. I was there one day, I think I was there for like 6 hours, just watching body after body be uncovered. And this man here, his name was Vladimir. He came to see if his brother was buried in the mass grave, and he identified his body. And this is the moment he found out that his brother was amongst the dead.
So when people are trickling back to town, is their first priority, or the first priority is to find where the mass graves are, and then in that volunteer spirit, they just start digging out? I mean, somebody said, I think it's over here, or I think it's over there.
No, the residents of Bucha, for the most part, knew that Ukrainians were being killed and then thrown in a ditch behind the church.
Okay.
Yeah, it was. I think if one family knows and they tell another family down the street, or they're in communication, so people kind of knew. And then other people who maybe were, hunkered down in their homes for weeks on end, or basements. Some people were in their basement and didn't see the light of day for weeks at a time. So they didn't necessarily know, and would come out to that news. And the digging was done by officials with the Ukrainian government. It was a very delicate process, obviously, because they wanted to not cause further damage to the bodies and to the remains, because they still needed to be identified. So they were handled with the utmost care, and by forensic specialists who knew how to handle the bodies and how to lay them out and identify markings and teeth and things like that. And it was
at this point, they're also documenting for war crimes as well.
Correct. Yeah, they were looking and inspecting at the ways that each individual was killed. So if we saw, if the forensic specialist saw a bullet hole to the head, to the skull, they could tell that some of the deaths were basically executions. A lot of the bodies that were exhumated were found with their hands bound behind their backs, which also leads officials to believe that it was they were killed in execution style. And that, you know, I didn't really, of course, I felt emotions throughout the time that I was there, but it didn't really send me into orbit until I saw Vladimir break down. And after he, watching him weep, you know, over the death of his brother, I my whole body was shaking, and I had to go and sit in that patch of grass and just breathe and kind of take a minute. The gravity of a space like that, it's, you know, you're watching it, and I might tear up a little bit, but you're watching it through your lens, and so it doesn't feel you're experiencing it, right? And then you take down the camera and you're there, and then you speak to the people that these atrocities have happened to, and then it you know, you can't yeah, just to feel the pain, just to even feel a, you know, an inkling of the pain that this man felt. It was absolutely heart-wrenching to watch them, you know, find their loved ones in this grave. Yeah, it was truly awful. Sorry, it's hard to talk about this stuff without.
If you want to take a break, Erin, you know, you can do that as well.
No, I'm good. I'm good. This is definitely like a heavy, you know, presentation. It's yeah, it's not easy, you know, I think also for audience members to look at these images sometimes.
Yep.
And then this is a picture of the bodies that were exhumated, and I think his brother, I'm pretty sure, was number 7, as you can see right here. And this is a photograph I took of Palm Sunday at St. Peter's Church. The church resumed services shortly after the exhumation of that grave. And I want to say this was maybe the first service that they had afterwards, but it was very solemn, very somber, but also very heartfelt and kind of amazing to witness the community of Bucha gathering in this way to just pay their respects and really take a moment to grieve, you know, their dead, and to also celebrate a really important holiday in their faith, which is Palm Sunday. And they would light a candle for you know, either people that they were praying for the loss of their relatives. And to kind of take things for a bit of a turn, these next sets of imagery I feel like are a bit more uplifting. I would say about halfway through my time in Ukraine, I began focusing my storytelling on women who were experiencing different parts of the war, whether that was through motherhood or giving birth or, you know, having to care for children. And this was a story that was sponsored by Glamour magazine. They commissioned me to find 4 female subjects who would share their stories with me and who I could follow around. And this is the type of storytelling I love to do. I think news is really important, and making those types of images from events is really important. But I specifically love to follow one person around and really get into their world and spend time with them and get to know their family and their kids and eat dinner with them. I mean, that's what makes me like really excited as a photographer, and to be able to document those really intimate moments. So this was at a maternity ward. And Frank, how are we doing on time? Are we okay?
We're okay. Don't look at the clock, Erin. But I do want to ask you a question. Was this a conscious decision, and is it sort of therapeutic to see life goes on in the most normal way of having babies and all of that? Does that help you to get away from the last four images? I mean,
Oh, it's necessary. I don't know if I could have been there as long as I did and stayed a sane person without balancing the atrocities
right.
with the more uplifting, hopeful narratives. And it's not all doom and gloom. Like a huge part of what was so inspiring about being in Ukraine was the Ukrainian spirit, their tenacity, their ability to unify as a people, as a country, as a culture, the resilience. I mean, that to me, it was really jaw-dropping to watch these people just like, pick up the scraps and like keep going. So yeah, I think, mentally it's therapeutic and cathartic, and then also it's a huge part of the story. So yeah, this was in a maternity ward that was in a basement. Early on in the conflict, when the sirens would go off, warning of either airstrikes or bombings, everyone would evacuate, or rather relocate to a basement, and that meant mothers and new mothers and expecting mothers. So here you have, a whole floor dedicated to women who were about to have their babies or had just had their babies. Like this woman who was, I want to say she was 9 months pregnant and expecting any day. And, hunkering down in a basement often meant sleeping on a 2-inch, memory foam pad on the cold floor. Again, that's where that resilience comes in, is these were tough, tough cookies.
I have to say, one thing we've seen with all of these presentations is how neat and orderly the Ukrainian people are. No matter where, whether it's in the train stations or here, it's all organized. It's like straight lines and everything. Sort of, they kept that their own humanity, their own decency, in this horrible situation.
They really did. They were exceptionally organized. It was impressive. It was kind of like watching a symphony play. It was just in unison.
Mm.
And everyone played by the rules. I was telling someone this yesterday, that at the start of the invasion, the Ukrainian government banned alcohol, from purchasing alcohol from stores, and of course restaurants and bars were closed, so that basically meant you couldn't get it. And I just was thinking about I love my own people, I love Americans, but how I could, how much would America lose its mind if the government put a ban on alcohol? And the Ukrainians, who I would say are fairly moderate drinkers, I mean, it's a part of their culture, they were like, okay, yeah, makes sense, like we have to stay sharp, it makes sense that they would stop selling alcohol. But just that, watching them just accept that and carry on, was pretty impressive.
Yeah,
And
it's interesting what triggers in your mind to remember, or notice. Like, yeah, no one's drinking. They're all closed, and like it registers in your brain as something significant.
yeah, of course the journalists still found a way to get booze. It doesn't matter where they are, they'll find a way. I think I had red wine every night with dinner.
The fixers. Yep. Give me a bottle of Cabernet.
Yeah. So this is one of the women I followed in the maternity ward. Her name was Ira, and she'd just had a baby boy. And this was, I think, the 2 days after she had a cesarean. and was walking down with her newborn to the basement after the sirens sounded, which meant that there was a threat of a bombing. So here she goes down. Her husband does not look particularly happy in this photo. But yeah, I mean, everybody just kind of, did what they had to do. This was another woman who had just given birth. We spoke for a short while. But again, very resilient, just tough people. And they didn't complain. That was the other thing, is they just were like, well, what would, like, this is what we have to do. Like, I have to protect my child. But they weren't even complaining about the conditions. This woman was handing out bananas and fruit and yogurt in the basement to expecting mothers. And this is Ira looking up when the sirens are going off.
So now you're sort of following her a little bit.
Exactly, yeah. Mm-hmm. And this was another, so I featured 4 women in the Glamour magazine article or spread that they ran. And basically the idea was to show the war through the lens of the female gaze, but in different capacities. So that was a new mother, whereas Tarja already had 2 kids, and she was living in the below ground in the metro on a subway platform, which is where early on people would gather when there were air raids or sirens. A lot of people were living down here, and she ended up staying, I'm going to say, for 2 months down there. And
this photograph illustrates exactly what I mean. Everything in there is so neat. She's in a neat space. On the sides there, everything is folded just so. They never lost their dignity.
They didn't. No, you're right. They were, and they had a lot of, they're a proud people, so I think that was important to them as well, to make sure that they, they also had a sense of that own, that personal dignity, not just for the media, but for themselves. Yeah. So this is Tarja's husband, this man here. He came back to say hello to her, to see her and their 2 sons. And he joined the Territorial Defense volunteer unit without her permission. He just came home and, the day of the invasion, and told her, I've signed up. So she was left to raise these 2 young boys by herself. And that's one of her sons. Very sweet. And I ended up posting these photos on Instagram and was able to raise about $5,000 for Tarja. So she went back to see her after I gave her the money. And this was after the story was published. I want to make that clear. We weren't raising money while I was photographing her. It was after it was done. And I came back and she had upgraded to this enormous, like 3-bedroom tent. So it was nice to see that the money that was raised by Instagram followers was put to build her a bigger underground house, which was nice. And so here she's trying to convince one of her sons to put on a coat, because they were going to go upstairs to get some fresh air and sunshine. And of course, he didn't want to wear his coat, even though it was snowing outside. Tough job to raise 2 little boys by yourself.
Kids are still kids, no matter what, right?
Right, yeah. And here she's feeding them soup that was given out for free by a volunteer group. It's her and her son at night. And this is the long escalator ride up to the top, so that they could get some air and some sunshine. She'd take them out every few days. Mm-hmm.
Any idea where the food was coming from? Linda's question?
She would go out and shop a little bit, a couple times a week. So for instance, in this picture, I went with her to the store, where she bought some sweets for the kids. And on the way to the store, we heard gunshots. So we quickly, came back. It at this point, it still wasn't safe in Kyiv. This was early on, probably the second week of the war. And then the other food would come from volunteers passing it out in the metro. And this was a woman I photographed who was at the train station saying goodbye to her husband who had to stay behind. This woman, Anna, was fleeing to the country of Georgia with her children. And of course, her husband couldn't come. And she's seen here behind the train door, kind of covering her mouth as she began to cry as the train pulled away. And this woman was a medic that joined the territorial defense as well to help volunteer. But she had a very interesting, hobby. She was a pole dancer. And that was her real passion, was pole dancing and art. And she's a very talented pole dancer. I've seen videos of her on Instagram. And had a school where she taught pole dancing. And then, of course, that wasn't open when the war started. So she decided to start doing medical work and training other territorial defense volunteers on how to do some light medicine.
She's got a frightening look. I'm not sure if I'd like to see her as a nurse or a pole dancer. I mean, which is more frightening? My God. But yes, she seems dedicated. That's great. She
was one of those women, like, I feel like if I met her in high school, I would have been too afraid to say hello. She was like so cool with her blue punk hair and her piercings and her tattoos. And I was totally in awe of her.
What a great spirit.
And here she is. This was the sort of territorial defense dog mascot. The dog was always up there. I ended up having to take care of the dog a couple times while she gave lectures. And they're packing medical packs here for soldiers to take to the front line.
And Erin, everything we're looking at is in a 3-month window.
Yes. Yeah, in fact, I think this work is mainly from the first month, which I don't mean to say that the first month was the most exciting, because I don't really like to use that word, but it was definitely where I feel like the first month there was the most activity, and it's when things were heightened the most, if that makes sense. And here she is doing a demo for some civilians sitting here in a theater to show them how to properly apply a tourniquet. This is her mom, who also has blue hair. I love that they both dyed their hair blue. And she said her mom was her best friend. And here she's just giving a kiss to one of her friends, also who volunteers at the unit. And this was a portrait of her that I can't remember if it was this one or a different portrait that ran on the digital cover of Glamour. But she was one of those people where you just see her and her eyes and her glow, and she was absolutely wonderful to photograph and very photogenic, obviously. Those eyes she looks like she's looking into your soul. And then this is the last picture I wanted to end on. This is Oksana, the woman I was just showing you. This is her mother. in the center, and two friends who are volunteers. And this was a picture that another person was taking, but I happened to get a shot of them jumping off this box. And this, this picture to me represents the resilience of the Ukrainians, and how, despite, just absolutely mind-boggling atrocities that they had to experience as a nation, we're still able to laugh and find joy and find moments of levity like this. And while they were jumping off this box, we could hear bombings going off, like, not super close, but close enough to where they were audible, and yet they were still laughing and joking around. And I think that's pretty remarkable, to just, the Ukrainians are able to carry on the way that they are. That is the last picture I have to share.
That is just such an uplifting presentation to just give us even more insights into the Ukrainian spirit. So let's unmute everybody, and I know Ingeborg has a question. So Jay is going to unmute everybody, right, Jay? Yeah.
People can now unmute themselves.
Okay.
They'll have to unmute themselves.
Ingeborg, you get the first question. Are you there, Ingeborg? You have to unmute yourself. Well, until she figures it out. When are you going back, Erin? Or what's your plan?
I'll definitely go back for the anniversary of the invasion. So that will be February of 2023. I don't know if I will be going back before then. I thought I was going to be back, since I left, but I haven't. Not purposefully, just I had a bunch of life stuff that I had to tend to.
Life has a way of getting in the
way.
way.
When you go to Ukraine for 3 months, all the other stuff piles up, and then you come home and have to deal with it. So, yeah.
Ingeborg, what's your question? Okay. Until Ingeborg figures out how to ask a question, we'll continue. So, as you reflect on this, how do you find a place to put this in your heart and in your head to move on, so that the images don't last with you, or they last with you, but you're able to move on normally when you get back home?
That is a great question. And Frank, I'm so sorry, my computer's about to die. I just have to go get my charger real quick.
Go.
Okay, 1 second.
And we'll see if Ingeborg can figure it out.
Okay.
Go. Get your charger. Ingeborg, are you there? And any other questions that people have? Now is the time to ask our friend. But it's interesting, of all the presentations, very uplifting at the same time being very compelling. And she really got into the normal things that go on.
Frank, it's Anya. Not a question for Erin, but and I know you have an extensive network of photojournalist colleagues, professional partners. Your profession is in this field, but how many of these photojournalists that you've brought to this series of sessions on Ukraine did you know prior to this, or how did you get connected to understand who was doing what? Just curious from a network.
I would say of the 25 or so that we have, I would say I knew 7 to 10. And then what happens, and people on the margins, but what happens is, if so-and-so sees that they've done it, and you have a certain amount of credibility, then somebody else wants to do it, and then somebody else, and it becomes very easy. I mean, as you can tell, all the photojournalists that speak, come with an honesty, come with a I'd love to do it. It's important to do it, from that standpoint.
I was curious, especially for the Ukrainian photojournalists that you've had on, Because I would assume that's a slightly different network than, the American photojournalist, et cetera, or, same thing.
But I will tell you that, and maybe Erin can speak to that. You start to team up with other photographers from around the world, and you start to know them. So if Erin knows somebody that I don't know, and I can mention Erin's name, oh, great, or they'll see Erin's presentation. Yeah, I'd love to do it. So only really one person that I've asked didn't get back to me, and that's fine. They'll come back at another time. But most of the people that you reach out to want to do it, and they come back because it's important. I mean, everyone will tell you that it's important that we're doing this because they want to, like what's his name, Eugene yesterday. He really wants, as horrible as a lot of that imagery was, they want it out. So you're back and charged up now, Erin?
Yes, I'm good.
Thanks,
Okay.
Frank.
So I don't know what happened to to Ingeborg, but she'll come back. So what do you think? I mean, as you go back for the anniversary, you assume that everyone else is going to go back as well. Like, how does that work? And where do you go? You go to I'll interrupt my own question. Do you go back to meet some of the people you've met? Do you go for news stories? What's your motivation?
Well, I think the news will have, unfortunately, Ukraine has kind of fallen into the background because it's not what it was last spring. The conflict is still, raging in the east, but I think because Kyiv is no longer under imminent threat like it was in February of this year, it's just fallen off the headlines. But there are still really important stories that need to be reported there. People's lives, life continues, right? Just because it's not in the headlines, it doesn't mean that it's not happening. I think that there will be a larger appetite during the anniversary, in which case it's a chance to tell stories and keep Ukraine in the headlines. Unfortunately, it'll still be short-lived, I think, but it is a chance where people will be remembering 1 year later. Anniversary stories always end up making the news. So for me, it's important to go back there and be a part of that conversation.
And do you see a real difference between the Americans? Like for us now, the next 2 weeks is going to be about the election, right? The election coming and the repercussions of the election. Then we get into Thanksgiving and then Christmas. I would assume it's different for the Europeans because they're so close to it that you have more content needs to get to the Europeans. They want it more than we may for this little period of time.
I don't know if that's true. I feel like with this conflict more than others, there was a real American concern and presence. Whether it was people raising money or really getting behind Ukraine. I think unlike other conflicts that are, every conflict is complicated, but I think this one, at least from the outside, had a somewhat easy to recognize good guy, bad guy component.
Yeah.
At least that's, it's, I think, more palpable that when we view things that way. And so it was kind of an easy thing to get behind for a lot of people. So yeah, to answer your question, I don't necessarily think it will be more important to Europeans. I think we'll see a spike in stories and concern and coverage in mid-February, and then probably March 1st it'll fall off again, because that's just how the news cycle works.
George, George Frank, I'm sorry. To Erin's point, we're maybe 20 people that have seen this presentation, and I've seen several other presentations, and it's usually about the same number of people, and many of the same people. and that's great that we're being exposed to this. But, I mean, isn't there a way to, make this more accessible? I mean, I know you have the YouTube channel, but I mean, could there be a book? Could there be a traveling exhibit? I mean, some way to really bring attention. I mean, because what Erin's doing, when these other photographers are doing, is just so much beyond what we're seeing on the nightly news. And there's got to be some way to really shake people up and make them understand what the hell's going on.
Well, you bring up a good point, and there has been, I don't know, Erin, if you were part of that book that's coming out with the women photojournalists, that, and your other point, George, is well taken. I'm trying to, and it's sort of like a first cousin that I never speak to, but institutions like Columbia University, like the Smithsonian, those types of places where you can put this together as a collection and then taking it on. So any help that, or any contacts in that space is welcome. I mean, I don't have the wherewithal to start to put a book together. I mean, that's a task that, we need a publisher for. But, the thing that we have to keep on doing is promoting it. You telling all of your colleagues, all of you, everyone, anyone knows somebody in the media, that's part of everyone's job to push it out. But I feel that pain very much, George.
Frank, it's Anya. I was going to say there's I see that as comparable to, there are a number of films that have come out recently. Also, either starting with the conflict that started in 2014 or more recently, there's one that my sister and I were involved in, primarily my sister, called The Rising Fury. And what they have done to do exactly what was just suggested by John and others is, and it's, I think, easier with film than it is with photography potentially, is, they are just fundraising to be able to go show their film at every single film festival possible. So they were just in Poland at the film festival. They're in Stockholm at a film festival. They were in New York at Tribeca Film Festival. They had a premiere at Lincoln Center, and they're considering their movies, their film, what they're calling it, kind of an impact film, which means they're obviously not raising money for themselves, but rather they're raising money to be able to assist whatever cause that may sponsor them to be there. So whether it's, one time it was Doctors Without Borders for the doctors that were going to Ukraine, for others it was for humanitarian aid. So I think with film it's a little bit different potentially. I'm less knowledgeable obviously about what goes on in the photography area, but I think that's been one way of kind of keeping this in the forefront of people's mind outside of what is in the news, which, as everybody's mentioned, has started to become kind of page 2, page 3, right?
There's a gentleman, Brian Storm, who owns a company called Media Storm. So he may be someone that I could, someone I actually know who may be able to put something together for this. Any ideas, Erin?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, if if it's any consolation, and I know more can always be done, but I probably get asked maybe once a week by different organizations to contribute in some way, whether that's interviews or platforms like this where I give a lecture, or it's contributing to a book project. There's so many groups out there doing different projects to amplify the war in Ukraine, the ongoing stories, that, I do feel like there's a lot of effort. It's just sort of, spread out, right? That doesn't mean that more can't be done, but, I think that, I think a lot of people have jump-started, either nonprofits or different platforms to where storytelling can be, to where we can get these stories out.
Yeah, well, we're gonna, we'll keep on doing this and trying, more ways to get it to more people, learning institutions. But as everyone knows, this platform, I'm open to any ideas, any suggestions, any connections that, I will reach out to anyone that can broaden out the audience for sure. So Erin, what I like to do is I like to let you have the last word of the evening. and, just give us perspective, give us, what you're thinking. And, again, I'm sure on behalf of everyone, we thank you very, very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. I want to get a picture so I can post it on Instagram. How do I make do I have to stop sharing my screen maybe?
You have to reshare your screen, Erin. We ended the screen share.
Okay, I don't want to reshare it. I just wanted, here. Wait, Frank, you have to talk so I can get
Okay.
Frank front and center.
Well, I'm a little bit camera shy, as most people who
Oh,
know
right.
will tell you. So that's going to be hard. But if you can make sure you get yourself and Anya and Mary and George and everybody in, that would be great. But that, yeah.
I got a photo. Well, last words. I don't know. I don't know what. Honestly, what I want to say is that there are so many conflicts out there still happening right now that are worthy of our attention along with this one. But I work a lot in Afghanistan, and when I think about the plight that Afghan women face on a day-to-day basis and that they've faced for the past 20 years, and this isn't to, at all minimize what's happened or what is continuing to happen in Ukraine, because it's of course it is massively important. It's just I think about a lot of conflicts that are forgotten or that we have fallen off our radar because of a lack of American interest or American political interest, specifically, again, Afghanistan, since we no longer have a troop presence there. But people are still suffering. And I guess, I don't know, that's sort of where I'd like to end things, is just to, try to keep an open mind to all the other places as well in the world that need our attention and ongoing support.
And I guess that is a perfect place, because it really is because of journalists like you and your colleagues that bring it to our attention. And that's why we respect and love you guys so much for what you do. And we're always, you guys are always in our prayers to be safe. And what you do is an invaluable, you're on an invaluable quest to keep us informed. And for that, we can only thank you with well wishes and prayers. So from
Those help a lot. Those help a lot.
That's good. Then that everyone can do is praying for all the photojournalists' safety.
Thank you everyone for spending your Wednesday night listening to me speak. I deeply appreciate it, and thank you, Frank, for having me. It's such a pleasure to be in such great company, and I really enjoyed it.
So
Thank you, Erin.
Thanks, Erin.
Thank you.
Good to see everybody.
And Erin, know that you have a standing invitation to come back whenever you have new work and you want to show, and it certainly could be about Afghanistan, or any of the travels that you're going. Tell us about the women's plight. We would, anytime you want to come back, that is a standing invitation.
Lovely. I'll take you up on that.
All right, you heard it.
Thank you again.
Good night,
Thanks.
everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
We're on tomorrow at 7.